Welcome back to a new episode and new series of Lifestyle AI, the podcast series. Now, over the years, we've focused primarily on AI and its different applications. Last series, we looked at drug discovery specifically, but this series, whilst AI is amazing and is going to be probably somewhere in the systems and the infrastructure of what each guest's either project or company does, we are going to be focusing more on a tech-centered digital health series, and we've got some really interesting people already lined up within digital therapeutics, within femtech, and specifically being kicked off today by Doccla, and we're joined by their CCO, Tom Breeze. So welcome very much, to the podcast. I'll do a very short introduction, and I'm sure you can give a much detailed one to both yourself and Doccla. But just want to say thank you to everyone who's listened so far during the series of the podcast. And as you'll all notice, this is the first one since we started back in late 2020 in person. So thank you very much for Tom to stopping in and joining us in our podcast room. And so it's a very, very exciting day for us, and will not be the only one in this series. But Tom joined Doccla following a successful stint at Babylon. He started as their CCO at the start of this year. And Doccla is a virtual ward startup, scale-up, SME, how you want to call it now these days. Definitions run wild. But there are a number of NHS sites with 35 different patient pathways, and their European expansion is fully underway. So as I said, Tom, please give a full introduction to yourself and into Doccla, but also what would be great to touch on is your purpose within healthcare, because you've been in there for a little while now. What is it that drives you, as well as a bit about you and Doccla?
Very good question. Very good question. So to start with, I suppose my background, we can maybe pull at some of the threads that run through here, was I left university and I thought I'll go do one of the things that people do when they leave university and they want a career in a beautiful shiny office like this in London. I'll go into private equity. And I soon realised that there were a couple of things about private equity that I didn't love. One of them was that we were looking really then at effectively kind of turnaround situations, buying distressed assets, all the rest of that stuff. And the second was that the sort of people who were making a success of their careers there had previous careers beforehand when they developed all of these amazing skills, so they might have come out of financial services somewhere and then they got into private equity. So I thought, right, I'll have those skills please, but I'd like to do them at somewhere where it's not about flipping turnaround businesses. It's a lot more purpose driven than that. Went and did some management consultancy and wound up after that at Babylon Health. So I kind of fell accidentally into healthcare, but I think that everybody who's worked in healthcare and gets stuck there has probably got some quite deep personal connection to it. And I think in the world of healthcare delivery, there are lots of obviously incredibly moving patient stories that you have, incredibly moving examples of interventions. For me, it's been a really deeply personal thing, in part because I've seen firsthand through, for instance, my brother suffered with a whole load of mental health issues, some addiction issues, some physical health issues that came around about because of that. And what you saw is you're bouncing between, in this case, mental health, primary care, acute care. You see that none of the systems are speaking to each other, and you have somebody whose healthcare journey was just a complete disaster, frankly, with ultimately very unpleasant consequences. And you just think, this is all so theoretically simple. You can wave a magic wand and get rid of it. And at that point, it's amazing. It's an attractive area to get into. And then the more that you start grappling with those processes and systems, you realise actually this magic wand idea was probably pretty fanciful to begin with. But you're hooked at that point. Yeah. You're hooked on the story. You're hooked on wanting to make a difference. And so that was it for me.
No, I think it's interesting. The bit I resonate with as well is once you fall into it, almost you're hooked and you're grabbed into healthcare. And as a recruiter in this space, I've only been working within the life science specific for about 3 and a bit years. Before that, I was looking at more on technology. And when I joined Cypro, one of the first indications we were looking at was imaging diagnostics. And it got me talking to my uncle, who's a radiologist in the NHS. And I always go on to this, how he works with a lot of the imaging companies out there, your Idents, your Brainomics, and X, Y, and Z. And so when we start to talk to these people that have been on the podcast and end up recruiting for them, and you can see the difference, a lot of the time as a recruiter it can be quite detached. But when you go around the Christmas dinner table and there's an actual year-on-year difference that you can feel from my uncle, and he really sort of communicates the differences to the patients on it. And I haven't got a sort of a direct personal story like yourself, but really resonates is almost when you land and you have a personal piece, you're kind of hooked to try and solve the problems. And the challenge is always how fragmented it kind of is, because it looks like a simple fix to most people. But when you go to these conferences and you see the different stakeholders, everyone's got different skin in the game somehow, it's super challenging for it. So where did that come from, and what, in terms of you moving into Babylon and then into Doccla, was it you were going into healthcare because it was healthcare, or was it because you thought Babylon's solution and then subsequently Dockla's solution could solve a piece of the puzzle for you in a really innovative way?
So I think both. You can have purpose, and you can have something that just has all of the force of obviousness and immediacy of a really great technical solution that would work in. You could almost transfer Babylon business model of saying, hey, GP consultations, but you can do them by video. Like, well, of course that's a good idea. Like, everybody knew at that stage that's going to happen at some point. It may or may not be Babylon that does it, and hey, in the future it may or may not be Babylon that does it, right? There've been tough times over recent years for them as a business. But there's no question that there's a revolution coming when you hear an idea like that. And I think then you looked at the other things they're doing. Hey, can you imagine that you can aid diagnosis of patients? You can provide a safety net via a whole load of AI and neural network kind of. I guess now everybody's talking about LLMs. That's exactly what Babylon was trying to build at the time. And sadly, something that probably cost a lot of money for Babylon to develop is now available relatively off the shelf for a knockdown price. But the idea was right. The market timing was pretty much right. Just a couple of things in the execution, the delivery, luck of the draw with things like a SPAC got wrong. So that's Babylon. Then you look across to something like Doccla, and there's another idea that just hits you with the force of a truck. Of course, if you've got a basket full of goods that can do pretty much exactly what it is that's being monitored in a hospital, and the only reason that this group of people were being kept in hospital was to be monitored, then of course it makes sense for those people to go home and be monitored there instead. It's better for the system, it's better for the patient. I think our patient satisfaction rates are about 99%, 98.6% as of today. And I mean, when you talk about the immediacy of patient stories, seeing impacts, even working within one of these businesses, within the commercial team, you can become a bit divorced from seeing individual patients. Partly that's right. It's because you shouldn't have access to patient data if you don't absolutely need to have it. But we try and start every one of our company all hands meetings with a patient story. And there's one that stood out to me. It's actually been on I think it's the BBC as well, which is this guy Brian, who just he'd had a really, really miserable time in hospital. I think he's a COPD patient, and he hadn't been able to sleep a wink. I think he's 88, something like that. Hadn't been able to sleep a wink for a few days. Your body at that age, if you're laid up in a hospital bed, starts to decondition, starts to deteriorate. There's a risk that you'll frankly never return to baseline health that you have. And he got to the point where, because of sleep deprivation and things like that, he was starting to hallucinate. And at that age, that's not good either. Instead, got him with a box of remote monitoring goodies. That gave clinicians the confidence to send him home, where, as he put it, got my wife, got my dog, got my own bed, just makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. It just, and what is really prevalent, and at the time we're recording this is the beginning of July, on last night on Channel 4 News, it was around the amount of people that had died unnecessarily in hospitals because the sort of care in the community, the social care wasn't quite set up right, and it's a massive problem for UK healthcare to solve at the moment. But when you say virtual wards, and I thought, when I first heard of this, 2 or 3 years ago, virtual wards, the idea is it could be something like, Sims, that sort of virtual world out there that is sort of make-believe, doesn't quite work. So I'm a little bit unsure on the definition of a virtual ward, personally, because I don't think, as you explain what exactly they are, they might not quite fit virtual for it. When you talk now about virtual reality and VR headsets, and they can come into it part of it. So what is it? Very simple terms, what is a virtual ward?
Yeah, so there's actually a very specific UK government definition of what a virtual ward is, and I'll expand on that a little bit. But so a virtual ward is, in this case, it is the provision of remote patient monitoring services where a patient would otherwise have been occupying a bed in a hospital. So if you are having your pulse monitored in hospital and your breathing rate and your blood oxygen saturation levels, if those are monitored instead in your home, that data is then, typically, at least as we do it, that data is then sent through to a tablet, something. Might include some patient-reported outcome measures, some questionnaires, surveys, etc., that sort of thing. How's your symptom today? Better or worse than yesterday? That sort of thing. Sensible questions. The same questions that you would be asked in a hospital. That's then relayed up to a clinical monitoring dashboard where there are clinicians who can look through that data and say, okay, this patient is clearly still well recovering, or this patient, we need to provide them with additional care. And on the whole, by virtue of the patients that are selected, they're patients who are at a relatively lower risk of needing immediate, urgent, emergency healthcare than, say, somebody who's in ICU. Clearly a bad candidate for a remote patient monitoring service. So the UK government, as I say, is kind of frames that, at least from a funding perspective, around a patient who'd otherwise be in hospital. But the same technology, when we talk about remote patient monitoring, that's the same technology for, let's say, a chronic patient. So if you've got type 2 diabetes, or if you've got chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, then those patients can be looked after in the community, have their vital signs monitored, and as a result, the sorts of interventions that a GP could make, or things like that, can reduce the number of times they're actually admitted to hospital in the first place. So if you were a COPD patient, you could say, hey, this patient's unstable, we're going to have a chat with them about their inhaler technique. It doesn't need to be complex. It's just stuff that we know works that isn't being done otherwise, and allows you to really tailor and focus your energies onto those people who are most at need of or most at risk of deteriorating and using a whole load of healthcare resources, and obviously having a miserable time. Yeah,
so it's like taking it away from I guess it doesn't want to sound bad here, or sort of take the emotion out of it, but taking it away from the human-to-human care in hospital and putting it more in situ where they want best through technology, almost.
Well, it's interesting because you remove some element of human human-to-human contact between clinician and patient in the hospital, but you compensate massively by, in terms of kind of the humanity of the whole experience, by helping a patient be at home. You can layer in the human-to-human contact with a clinician by video consultations and things like that. You can do all of those things through a remote patient monitoring platform. You can message, you can send picture messages if you like, all of that lovely stuff, from the comfort, as you say, of your own home, with your family, with your pets and things. Because one of the things I think is really interesting is that people won't just engage with technology if they don't, if they're just sending stuff off into the ether, into space. So, for instance, as a an element of the Doccla technology that acknowledges that is if you send something, even if what you've sent is all within the normal range, there's no reason for a follow-up, you'd still get a little nudge back from somebody to say, yeah, I've read it, you look okay. Because otherwise people just don't send it anymore, they can't be bothered.
Yeah, there's always that kind of contact be within it. And when we were at a conference recently, there were two consultants from IQVIA there, and they were doing a presentation, and part of it was around digital health trends. When they did their report in 2021, the most used group of DTX sort of demographics in Germany were women between 50 to 59. So you kind of think, and I think, that my mother's just out of that demographic now. She won't, hopefully by the same, but I think, she's relatively, technophobic, has only just got an iPhone recently. But you just sort of see the healthcare need is there, and the touch points are there if we create products that are enabling the humanity of the process to be stronger. Because also nobody particularly likes going to hospital very often. We've got to remember we're trying to put people in the situation where they're best. And looking at the Doccla technology and platform, you've got 35 plus patient pathways, right? Just explain what that is in terms of how you set up the technology and how that interfaces with the wider healthcare ecosystem, so that someone that is maybe listening now and can understand the Doccla technology in a bit more depth.
Yeah, sure. So first thing is we've got 35, 45 in fact, kind of pre-configured, but everything's been built to make it as customizable as possible. Hepatology may be handled one way at one trust, for instance. It might be handled quite differently at another trust, or there are subsets of patient groups. Equally, where you have a large number of patient pathways, you might establish that really a patient with these 12 conditions basically needs the same level of monitoring. They're not massively acute, and so you can just group them and say, oh, well, these are the medium severity patients of such. So by enabling people to group patients as the clinical experts in a given hospital see fit, you can map what we're doing to a given way of working in a particular system. So that's the concept. In terms of the nuts and bolts of it, you can sit there and go, okay, so what are the things that are going to mean that we think a patient is suitable to be admitted onto this ward? You ask the clinician, you might have a few prompting questions as well, and this would all be done by a clinical team. Right? A humble commercial person wouldn't pretend to give clinical advice or what have you to the medical director of some trust. We do that, elicit effectively what the admission requirements are, and then you're setting, well, what are the clinically relevant vital signs for that patient? Is it pulse oximetry? Is it blood pressure? Is it weight, for instance? Heart failure pathways, cardiac pathways, obviously a really important comorbidity. There's again, in terms of this list of devices, you go for activity tracking, whatever it is, you can keep going and going. These days, it's probably going back 5 years, getting data off devices was difficult. These days it's a lot easier because most people are working to open standards they want to be integrated with, because they want to form parts of systems like this, because then they'll be used and they'll be sold more. So it's quite easy to include new measurements, so long as you've got a way to display them. And you sit down and you can design patient flows and pathways and things like that say, okay, well, we're going to ask this patient to submit these vital signs 3 times a day for the first 5 days, and thereafter once a day. And if Mr. Simpson's blood, pulse oximetry, oxygen saturation level, goes below 90%, well, that's a red flag. And say, well, we'll call in the SWAT team, clinical SWAT team, to sort it all out. Whereas for somebody else, that level might be 88% or 92%, or here I'm sure there'll be outrage comments about getting the percents wrong, but that's the principle. So you want to be able to customize to groups and to individuals, and you want to leave all of that entirely at the discretion of a clinical professional who can sort it out within 15-20 seconds.
And how does the patient interact with your technology?
Yes, they've got their box, got a Doccla box, been handed one of those maybe on the ward, or maybe it's been sent to them at home, depends on the situation. And we guide them through onboarding. There's a tablet in there and a set of devices. So let's say switch on your tablet and it'll then guide you through, I am on X pathway, and that will ask you to submit a series of measurements. It may ask you to submit responses to a series of questions, like I say, subjective, how are you doing today? Could be mental health questions in there as well. So include a lot of questionnaires on that. And at the end of it, press submit. All of that is then sent up to the cloud via a SIM in our tablet, and you can connect it to Wi-Fi, but better for people with dodgy connections, or to avoid the need for patients to have to connect all this stuff together and then connect it to their Wi-Fi networks. Much easier. Send it out with a SIM, everything prepared. Somebody who's in their 90s, hard of hearing, can't see particularly well, for instance. You don't want them to be trying to connect this packet of stuff to their Wi-Fi network. On the whole, much easier to have sorted that for them.
And that's a really innovative piece, because one of the questions that I've always had is something like this in this sort of market, does it have the potential to make the healthcare gap, sort of healthcare accessible gap, smaller, or does it exacerbate because you are potentially taking out the access of people that haven't got infrastructure for technology?
So I think you've got to bend over backwards for people who don't have access. So that's why you do things like put in a SIM card for somebody who'd struggle to connect things to the internet. Why you we work with interpreter services, so people don't speak English as their first language. You make it all accessible for people with visual impairments, things like that. Text to speech, whatever it is, you work around a lot of that. And then I think that's also why we find we might spend between 20 minutes and an hour and a half onboarding a patient. So we're onboarding them, we're onboarding their family, we're onboarding their carer, whoever it is who needs to be involved in that person's care, to make sure that they can use the service, because there is that risk of exacerbating differences. At the same time, you have to be careful that if something works for, with all of this love, affection, attention around it, if something works for 99.8% of people from all walks of life, backgrounds, physical disabilities, whatever, then you have to be really, really careful that you don't say, well, it doesn't work for this one person and therefore everybody else has to stay in hospital now. You can't use a virtual ward service. So, but it should be something that significantly reduces barriers to care rather than increasing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we focused then at the sort of preface the discussion around Doccla on the UK and the innate need for virtual wards now. And this won't be a silver bullet, as there's no magic wand. You probably need more magic wands than Ollivanders for healthcare to get it all fixed. Looking wider to Europe now, as mentioned at the start, your European expansion is well underway. And so what do you see in terms of European healthcare, the challenges, and how does virtual wards, and to a subsection of that, Doccla, work to solve some of those challenges? And maybe as a follow-up, how differential they are, you're noticing now, between the UK and Europe as wider?
Yeah, so almost everybody suffers from the same two problems in healthcare globally and in Europe. One of them is lack of healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and all of the other set of healthcare workers that go around that, whether it's pharmacists or physios or what have you. Every country that I've ever looked at suffers from that, from the US to Norway to Germany to Spain, wherever. And then the second is lack of physical beds, essentially, hospital beds. Now, almost everybody suffers from that. Pretty much the only people who don't in Europe are in Germany, the Germans, who have, I think, something like 3 or 4 times the number of beds per capita that we do in the UK. So they've got slightly different incentives. They've got they've got a healthcare system that's set up with payers and providers. It has more similarities to, well, let's say to the Dutch system rather than the US system. But somewhere there's the US system over here, there's a UK system over here, and somewhere in the middle.
There you go.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how sort of they always do well on the sort of the quality of care, and then the UK and US are sort of bookending it somewhere as well, because we choose two extremes of the systems, maybe. So
yeah, with the UK, it's certainly the healthcare system's been under a lot of pressure over the last 5 years or so, and it feels like it's been ratcheting up, because 5 years before that people were talking about the fact the healthcare system is under the worst pressure ever, and 5 years before that I'm sure it was the same. But it has been, therefore, unfortunately, steadily getting harder to make a healthcare system work in the current funding environment with the NHS. So but it does provide on the whole better value than most other healthcare systems, and certainly until very recently was a world leader for quality too. Waiting times and things like that don't argue in its favour at the minute. But hey, we're here to help in our own small way. But yeah. So I think there's all sorts.
You went for the sort of the trying to create more beds for people who need them. Is that sort of where Doccla comes in to sort of trying to solve a problem, and part of that is also, I guess, linked to staffing a little bit as well.
Yeah. So the ratio of patients somebody can look after in a virtual ward is significantly higher than in a physical ward, just by virtue of the physics of it. So that's one thing, and that helps solve staffing issues. The second thing is the beds, where clearly you're moving people out of a hospital bed, and therefore there's a free hospital bed, and that's a good thing. But then there's all of these arguments as well around patient outcomes, patient satisfaction. Certainly, we talked about that a bit earlier. So there are economic arguments, there are system pressure arguments. But then there's also just a fundamental thing, which is to go back to what motivates you. Why do you get into healthcare? Well, it's normally not to do something cheaper. It's to do something better and the right thing for patients.
And I think when we were at a conference, and I can't remember who was speaking about, I think it was someone who was an investor, and he was explaining his dad was a physician in America.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, always remember why physicians get into healthcare. There's an easier way to make money. There's an easier way to use your knowledge as well, because incredibly smart people. So it's normally around the point of care and quality of care, which they're doing. And we were specifically thinking about what does digital health do on a wider scale, and what can it take away from some of the physicians, especially when it's an environment where there are a lot of staffing pressures. So you're having to do a lot more on your resource, and therefore and a lot of the tasks are relatively, for their level, can be mundane.
Mm-hmm.
And so virtual wards, DTX, diagnostic systems that are AI-based or assistive, all of those things allow people to work, what was being said, at the top of their license. To really sort of, I guess, stretch them in a way, but work on those things while they spent, 7 or 8 years in education to do for us, and then they can give the quality of in situ care that the person wants to be in the environment they want to be through a virtual ward for it. So it definitely has a quality of care, but probably there's an argument that it increases the work satisfaction, career satisfaction of the clinicians and physicians as well that are using.
No, I agree. I think there's a bit where the rubber hits the road here on quality versus the kind of system pressures and things like that. And that is because of the way things are set up, with clinicians having to take significant responsibility and risk on decisions they make about patients. We hold a individual clinician responsible if they make the wrong choice. That interacts there's a strong tension between that and innovation. And so if you've got a patient who you can keep under your care for a couple of days longer, and not move to, for instance, a virtual ward setting, then you're you're relatively well incentivized and rewarded by the system for doing that, because you're not taking on this risk of new model of care and maybe they shouldn't have been referred and so there's that. But what you're seeing as a clinician there is the patient in front of you, and you're not seeing the 10 queued up in an ambulance on stretchers outside who are waiting for that bed. So the patient that's being that's suffering is the one that's like not currently being cared for by you. So there's this that for me is where there's a tension between system thinking and an individual incentives and ethics for clinicians as well, who will obviously desperately want to do the right thing for patients. You've just got to make sure they're doing the right thing for as many patients as possible. Yeah. So I mean, the first, I guess I wanted to start off on this by just noting that one, I think the UK is doing really well here. Internationally, the UK is doing well. It's a leader in policy. It's a leader in execution in virtual wards. And the reason it's doing really well is not due to companies like Doccla. It's due to the amazing work that our clients are doing, right? So it's talked a lot about Doccla and the system and all the rest of that stuff, but ultimately there are clinicians out there who are taking the risk, pushing the envelope on new and interesting and innovative models of care, because they've gone out of their way to find out about it and they want to do the best for the patients in their care, and they're now making a massive difference to patients' lives. So the first thing I want to say is, before we talk about the difficult bits, is just to acknowledge that actually this is really hard, and people in the UK will get a kicking in the press, I'm sure, because it's fun to do so, but my God, are they doing some amazing work. So that's thing one. Now, in terms of the challenges, I think again you get stuck on a bit around behaviour change, a bit around how do you ensure that a clinician feels comfortable that the immediate decision for them is exactly the right thing for that patient. How can you convince them that this new thing, sending a patient further away from them, how can you convince them that they don't need to feel nervous about that? And to do that, obviously, you need to create a big body of evidence. You need to make sure that evidence is not just numerical, it's anecdotal as well, around this was what happened in your area with your patients that you've seen. And it's not enough just to say we increased throughput by 38%. And respectfully, kind of nobody actually cares that much about it. They don't get excited and go home. It's so there's bits definitely on improving how well understood the technology is, and then the next thing on that, I think, is that there's this whole there's a whole debate around incentives and the extent to which you want to bring more of the population on to lower acuity virtual wards, so remote patient monitoring as opposed to virtual wards in the definition I gave earlier. Just get as many people onto the system as possible to increase the level of understanding we have of the population, and to be able to intervene in their healthcare in a way that actually helps drives the numbers we're talking about, and from there it should be easier to convince people.
Do you think there are collective solutions around it, from a knowledge sharing point here around sort of technology providers to healthcare systems, or would, and it might be both, or would there be stronger impacts made if there was stronger European harmonisation around systems, regulatory environments? You think of the difference between the US. Yes, there's a democratized system state by state, but it's very, very different in Europe. You've almost got to have a strategy country by country, and that leaves out some of the smaller countries and where you go into, because they haven't got the economic revenue stream for you to go into?
Yeah, so I think standardization around care pathways or patient access requirements or things like that. These things exist, or a lot of them exist, and I think they do make a huge difference. And where you have federalized systems like in Germany, for instance, and you've got to go and register with every individual kind of the equivalent of a Moldova or whatever it is. That is that's really challenging, and it makes it difficult for you to operate at a cost that makes sense. Because all of these things cost time, money, and energy. And so if you've got to do it 30 times for a country, you've got to do it 50 times in Europe. It's pretty painful. So harmonisation, helpful. Standards, probably more and more robust standards is good, and at the same time as allowing you access different markets with a kind of one and done approach, it also means that you're, in terms of this confidence and consumer confidence, it means that you're guarding against people putting absolute dross out there that puts patients at risk. So it's healthcare rather than like a game app or whatever.
Absolutely. I think it was really interesting. Absolutely. I think it was really interesting around sort of like devices. People are very keen to utilise technology in healthcare, but they will only utilise it, well, they'll mostly utilise, I think it was the 80 percentile up there was saying they would use technology if their healthcare practitioner presented them with the technology. Because it has to have that authority. So it's not just going to be another app. There's a massive thing around app fatigue on it, and how do you get someone engaged, set up, but then long term keep it in? Is it your HelloFresh, is your banking app? Okay, that's your healthcare app. And are you going to use it with it? So I think the authority around that, around making sure that the healthcare practitioner delivers it, is super, super important. And you're right with harmonisation and the standards piece. I think is going to be super important. And we're seeing different legislation coming in now with digital health in Germany, so fingers crossed that goes through. I think we're all here, and hopefully that all follows out and then what's there. And just want to very, very finally, this is life-site AI, and I said we were going to focus so much on it, but you mentioned the LMM models that Babylon were looking at earlier as well. So what can that do for virtual wards?
Yes, so if you think, this follows on quite neatly from your last question, that you've got all of this data coming from various points, and with remote patient monitoring technology on the whole, you're going to have a far greater number of touch points than you would do without it. Right? That's the point. You bring down the cost of each touch point to the level where it's relatively trivial. And you can have 3 a day without much problem, and if you want to have 12, that's fine. We probably wouldn't recommend you do it, it's a waste of time. With all of that, and the potential to combine data from EHRs, the potential theoretically to combine data from, for patients who are out and about and at the less acute end of things, data from mobile devices if they choose to opt into that. The sky is the limit, obviously, in terms of the number of inputs that you that you use, subject obviously to patient consent. But you should then be able to make increasingly sophisticated judgments about what is most likely in terms of the next thing that happens to the patient. When you think about the way that LLMs work, they're basically, my unsophisticated Luddite understanding is they're pretty much always kind of picking the next word in a sequence, the next most obvious word, how do you finish the sentence type thing, based on this extraordinarily large data set and well-trained intellect, I guess, artificial intellect. And if you make that a patient journey rather than a sentence, the analogy is like quite easy. It should be an amazing, just an extraordinarily good way of picking or identifying a risk of the next thing that happens to a patient being a bad thing. And that's the point at which we should get involved, and we should make sure that patient is in for planned care, to have their healthcare reviewed by a clinical professional, rather than the next time they see somebody that's in the back of Completely agree. I think a car is a really good analogy. The onboard computer that tells you which bits are wearing down at what speed, and all the rest of it. When you couple that with the care, the living, breathing care, then you've got a way of you've got a way of interacting with the system of the body, the system of the healthcare, that means that everything's dialed in and can be dealt with before it becomes a big issue, before you break down the middle of the M11 and go careering to the back of a bus, in healthcare terms. Definitely.
So hopefully you've had fun, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed listening and hopefully watching this one in much more vigour than on the YouTube's episodes, which are always a little bit shaky over Zoom. So please listen to the rest of the episodes on this series and go back and listen to anything else that you find interesting around the use of AI in healthcare on the previous series. But thank you very much again for listening and watching.
Thank you very much.
Great.